Welcome, everyone, to October 3rd Thursday, Writing Fully Realized Characters. Thank you all for being here tonight. Welcome also to those of you tuning in live on YouTube. I'm Sarah Renee Beach. I'm the program director here at the Writers League of Texas. We're joined tonight by such a stellar panel of writers who all have thought really deeply about this topic. So I'm personally extremely excited we get to learn from them. Um, so to introduce our wonderful panel, our first panelist is Sherri L. Smith. And I'm going to read an abridged version of Sherri's bio, but I encourage you to go to our website and check out the full bio because Sherri is amazing. But Sherri L. Smith is the author of 9 award-winning fiction and nonfiction books for young people, including the 2021 Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators Golden Kite Award winner, The Blossom and the Firefly, and the California Book Awards gold medalist, Fly Girl. She also writes comics, including Wonder Woman, Bart Simpson comics, and James Cameron's Avatar. Sherri holds a certificate in the art of archetypal fairy tale analysis from the Assisi Institute and a certificate in enchantism from Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she is currently studying applied mythology. Sherri currently teaches in the MFA and Children's Writing program at Hamline University, and her new nonfiction book with Elizabeth Wine is American Wings, Chicago's Pioneering Aviators and the Race for Equality in the Sky, and her new graphic novel is Pearl, with art by Christine Nori. Sherri, we're so lucky to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello.
Oh, Siri thinks I'm talking to her, not you, Siri. And our next panelist is Alex Temblador. Alex is the mixed Latin award-winning author of Half Outlaw, Secrets of the Casa Rosada, and Writing an Identity Not Your Own, a guide for creative writers. She received her MFA in creative writing from the University of Central Oklahoma and was a contributor to Living Beyond Borders, Growing Up Mexican in America, and Speculative Fiction for Dreamers, a Latinx anthology. Her creative work has appeared in Colorado Review, Palabradas, D Magazine, among others. Based in Dallas, Alex is the executive director of Right Here DFW and the moderator and founder of the Lit Talk series. Alex, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And last and certainly not least is Meg Vondriska. Meg does not feel like a writer, but that has not stopped her from dreaming up stories in the margins of notebooks since grade school, and is certainly to blame for her poor understanding of algebra. I can relate. She grew up in rural Wisconsin, but currently resides in Austin, Texas, with her husband Ryan and their dog Tonks. When she is not writing, she can be found riding her horse or sitting on her patio with a glass of red wine and a good book. Her debut book, A Tale of Two Titties, A Writer's Guide to Conquering the Most Sexist Tropes in Literary History, published in July 2024. Meg, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Having me. I feel like I need to write a much more polished bio to follow in Alex and Sherri's footsteps.
No, that's the most amazing bio, Meg. Don't change it.
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
When your first book is just all snark, you kind of forget that like other people don't write books that have a lot of swear words in them.
I wouldn't say that.
I
So
do.
clearly a very wonderful panel we have gathered here this evening. I do want to say before we dive in, I want to let our audience know that they are welcome and encouraged to submit questions. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, there's a Q&A box. You just submit your question there, and we will get to them towards the end of the program. But yeah, thank you all for being here. So excited to jump into this conversation. I have a million questions, so I'm just going to jump in. But from books to classes, this is a topic each of you have taken a particular interest in. So I'd love to hear from each of you how writing fully realized characters came to be a topic of interest, and how you define that for yourselves and why you think it's important to get right. And Sherri, I'd love to start with you if that's okay.
This is very weird. I'm used to being last because of my last name. So thank you to the V's and T's of the world. I finally know what it's like to be an A. For me, I find that particularly in a first draft, and a second and a third, my protagonist is the most boring character of everyone in the book. Like all of these interesting secondary and tertiary people pop up, and I'm like, ooh. Like I mentioned that rat character earlier, he is not the main character, and there are two main characters to that book. And they're fine, but so I tend to fall in love in the margins. And the trouble with that is I do think writing a good character is a bit like falling in love, because you have to get to know them, and it takes more than one draft sometimes to understand the nuances of that character. But what I learned a long time ago, I used to have a blog called The Middle 100, because when actually an early draft of The Toymaker's Apprentice, my manager at the time, I gave it to him, and he was like, Sherri, the first 100 pages are incredible. The last 100 pages are the best you've ever written, but that middle 100, and I just imagine that instead of like rising action, that it looked like a circus tent that had collapsed in the middle. And it took a bit of learning to realize that part of that was not knowing my main character. And as I got to know them and figure out what they wanted, it propped up the tent in a way that really, allowed the circus to perform. So that's how I got interested in just seeing my own character faults, I guess.
I definitely want to come back later to that idea of the secondary and tertiary characters, but thank you so much. Meg, what about you?
Well, Allison in the chat, like the bad dates, similarly, having dated some men who had interest in really shitty books, that kind of was the impetus originally for really starting the Twitter account Men Write Women, which later inspired A Tale of Two Titties. And it was really something I wish I could say it was something noble, but it truly was formed out of spite and just sheer frustration of reading all of these female characters who were described by their anatomy and literally nothing else. And so, A Tale of Two Titties just really came together as a way to talk about, the medium of fiction, but also just the way that it affects our lives around us, whether it's advertising, which for better or for worse is my day job, or if it's, the media and the television shows that we're consuming on the regular, and just trying to challenge the way that we default to writing women.
Yes. And your book is hilarious, I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. It's when it starts from spite, it's very easy to kind of put that energy in there, and, thinking about, all of the science fiction that I read for men that I dated, and thinking about how, you want to be the gone girl, cool girl monologue of, no, I love this, it's so good. And then you reflect back on it and you're like, gosh, that was, in hindsight, really, that was a sex scene that's just like not anatomically possible, no matter what alien race you are. Like, that's just a weird thing to write about. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's powerful to learn about what not to do.
Yeah. There's so
Alex,
many.
yes. Alex, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm a fiction writer and nonfiction. Just personally, as working on my novels and stuff, I always had an easy time crafting a fully realized like main character protagonist. So it's funny that Sherri was talking about like tertiary and secondary characters, because I always wanted characters that came from different identities. And as somebody who saw a lot of my identities portrayed incorrectly in, novels or TV shows or films or whatever, I didn't want to do the same thing and like contribute to that harmful cycle. So that is kind of what I was focusing on in terms of my own fiction. But I did writing an identity not your own, which delves into the idea of writing other identities, but very specifically like historically marginalized identities, and looking at it from maybe like a research and educational perspective, not just as like the novelist, but I was approaching it as like, how do we create characters, and do we think about how we create characters do we teach people to think about how they create characters? I got my MFA. I've been in different like writing programs and groups, and the workshop format is great, but also I remember no one taught me how to write a character. No one taught me like, here's the way to approach it. Here's the way to make sure they're authentic and fully realized and concrete. If I did it wrong, I might get feedback in the workshop, maybe, but nobody could give me like concrete answers, guidance. Here's what to do, here's what not to do. So that's what I really wanted to do with writing an identity not your own, and help people to sit back and rethink their process of building a character. At what point do we get to a fully realized character? Is it stereotypical? Are there tropes still in there? Is this, a flat character, etc.? So that's kind of how I came to this process.
And it's such a fantastic book, and super comprehensive. And I'm sure we'll only scratch the surface of what's included in there today. But I want to stick with you for this next question. So, what is the work you do before you even start writing to flesh out who your characters are?
Yeah, I mean, so when I'm talking about, writing a character, and like, let me also start by saying that most writers will be writing characters who are not their identity, or have at least one identity that's different from them. Like that's just usually going to happen. You're not going to have every character that's the exact same identity as you in every single aspect in terms of like wealth and gender identity, etc. Um, so I think some of the first steps is really getting to know your character's background, like who are they as a person, basic things like you would fill out at a doctor's office. What is their name, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity? Do they have disabilities? Were they born in the US? Where do they live in the US, if they live here? What languages do they speak? All of those things in terms of like their education, their relationship history, all of those things impact a person. What that helps you to, if you know those things, it helps you to build intersectionality of your character. Start thinking about how all of those things work together to create your character's motivations, etc. If you are focusing on a historically marginalized community in terms of crafting your character, I always tell people it's great to, read books by authors of that identity, and to listen to media and to consume media that is created by people of somebody of that identity. It's also great to do research. Those are probably, I would say, easy steps, but sometimes people don't take them. Probably the hardest thing is to integrate yourself into the community, connect, understand what's the issues going on there, what's the joys of being in that community, what are the stereotypes that that community faces, what are things that you need to know that you can only find by being an ally, being an accomplice within that community, and understanding really what's at stake if you don't get this characterization authentic and as fully formed as you possibly can.
Thank you. Meg, what about you? What are some of the pre-writing strategies that you do before you even start writing?
Well, it's so funny. Alex and I have actually talked about this a lot, coming into titties from like a nonfiction perspective, where everything I know it is fun to talk about with extended family and coworkers. Coming into that experience and using it as a way to remark on existing IP, whether it was, fiction books or current television shows, and now pivoting and trying to write fiction now, I find I take out Alex's book. I mean, it's legitimately post-it noted, on the shelf. But I think, kind of building off of what Sherri and Alex have said so far, which is really building like a diverse community around you. You have to have a diversified bookshelf. And I think, when I initially started this Twitter account, people were like, oh yeah, you just have to read a lot of women. And it's like, well, yes, but also no, you need to make sure that you're genuinely diversifying your bookshelf. You need to make sure that you're reading writers of color, as well as non-binary authors and other LGBTQ representation. Like you can't just pivot to one and have it as a default. I do think, in that way, reading, as we all know, is such a wonderful tool. That research too has its own merit. But I'm really, especially when it comes to the fiction characters, building it, myself, and really trying to take what I learned in Titties of like, oh gosh, we can't continue to write marginalized communities as the default. And I think, Alex and Sherri's work also really speaks on that. It's easy to do the default. It's harder to teach yourself to grow.
Beautifully said. Sherri, what are the pre-writing steps you're taking before you're even writing your characters?
Say I do terrible things to my students because I've taught for a lot of years, and I'll be like, oh, do a dating profile and learn all about your character before you blah blah blah. I hate that stuff personally, and I am there are pantsers and there are plotters in writing, right? And the pantsers fly by the seat of their pants and the plotters plan. I am an immaculate outliner. I am a total planner. And I plot along, except for my characters. I pants them. And I've never admitted that before because I've never really thought about it. I discover them through the story and through the writing. And then I go back and think about it. Because sometimes you can sell a book on a pitch. Blossom and the Firefly sold it on a pitch, and I sort of pants my characters are going to be like this because that'll give me some juice. And then we sold the book and I had to write it. And I was like, well, that's not culturally accurate. And that's not this and that's not that. And I'm like, okay. So I tend to write my assumptions and my biases. And then I go through and correct them. I examine them and find out like, well, where did that come from? I had a girlfriend, she said, oh, could you make the mean girl not be blonde? Because, blonde girls get a lot of flack. And I was like, I totally hear you. And yeah, I will for the next book because it had to be there for a reason for that book. Because there was a non-blonde character who was going to go blonde, and there wasn't like, it needed to be, a comparison, but I try to think about that. I try to interrogate my writing a lot, and then if I can't see it, have somebody else read it. And yeah, if I'm writing outside of my lane, try to get readers who are in that lane to give you some feedback. I do tend to write all over the place. I don't stick to one or a few identities, so I am all about the research. And I'm also about travel and getting to know the world so that it isn't just like, how a girl from Chicago imagines what it's like to be a Japanese pilot in World War II, that like I try to do deeper work than that.
So as you're developing your characters, kind of pantsing them, and tapping into their motivations, what are some ways you're kind of developing them as you're writing?
If you take my class, you'll hear me call it badgering the witness. Like, what do you want? Just what do you want? Is such a big question to ask your character, because when you know what they want, it gives you the engine. That's where the title of my class comes from. It gives you the engine to drive the story forward, but also recognizing that what you say you want is not actually what you want. And then what you actually want is not necessarily what you need. And so that can take a few drafts of really understanding what's going on, what's the secret that you haven't told me, because I'm assuming this might be true for the other writers here, that your characters start speaking to you and they become real. And that's why we love so many of our own characters, because they are themselves. They're not of us, they're through us. And you start to listen to them and understand what you're getting wrong. I had to do a massive rewrite on a book that was written as a young adult book with a 16-year-old protagonist. And they were like, okay, great, but make it 8th grade, make her 13. And you lose a lot, right? Bye-bye romance, bye-bye driver's ed, all these things. But it was an interesting exercise in learning what mattered to the core of my character, like who she would be at 13. If that's who I knew her to be at 16, who was she 3 years before? And that was really, I recommend it. I don't recommend it once you've written a whole novel because that sucked, but I recommend like write your character at different ages and figure out what made them who they are.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds like a very challenging but rewarding exercise.
Yeah.
Um, Alex, what about you when you're developing your character as you're writing? How are you doing that?
Yeah, what's funny, I'm gonna admit, kind of similar to what Sherri just said. I actually start pantsing my character at the beginning. I can like so I go between pantsing and plotting. It depends on the project. Um, but usually like I can, even if I do plot out a whole story, I'll pants my main character for at least a few chapters, if not like a quarter of the way through. Once I kind of get a feel for their voice, like that's the thing I'm trying to connect with. I do tend to like fill out the I like call it the doctors or the psychology form, um, where I need certain little details to understand their motivations and their wants to keep them going forward. I want to say like for Rocky, which is one of the main characters for my second novel, I, really needed to see like is she's a lawyer, but also what specific type of law is she into? And like actually her lawyer career doesn't really play a lot of like it doesn't have a big role within the story. But those little elements help to make sure it's authentic and real and um she's seeing, I know those little things she's going to see and notice stuff in her day-to-day life within the story. Um, that if I didn't know what she like specialized in law in, I wouldn't be able to speak to that. So it kind of differs depending on my project. Also, I want to go back and say I love that Charisse says she writes out her biases and her stereotypes and like all of those things. Um, and bragging on Meg in her book, A Tale of Two Titties, she actually has a ton of exercises that encourages writers to do that, to know what not to write. And so I'm a big fan of both of those things. So I just wanted to point that out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Um, Meg, what about you when you're developing, when you're kind of in the thick of it? How are you staying in touch with the character and developing them?
Dialogue. No, no, actually the what do they want and the what do they need is a method that I really thought that I was going to be a pantser when I started writing. And then I realized that my type A sensibilities, why I have a paper planner might have been a sign that that's probably not the case. So the what do they want and the what do they need was like an enlightening, ridiculous light bulb moment for me, but specifically with side characters, I think it's that has always been my struggle. And I recently was talking about this with a friend that I really struggle with dialogue with my side characters because I feel like I know my main character. I know what she wants. I know what her weaknesses are. I know what makes her tick, and I know where we're going to end up. But those side characters are so hard to understand and kind of building out a little web of like, here's all of the things that make Lysander, and here's his like childhood trauma. But that has really kind of started, the little character map, of who they are has been really helpful. But yeah, it was interesting the realization that you can't just BS your way through everything, unfortunately.
Hey,
Yeah,
Sarah, can I add one thing
please.
to
Yeah,
this whole conversation and the
yeah.
question? I don't do this, but there's an author called Latoya Watkins in Dallas who we were on a panel at Dallas Literary Festival, and she takes her characters to therapy. And I'm not saying this like metaphorically, like literally, she will take her character and who they are to a therapist and talk through like their motivations with the therapist, which I thought was genius. And it's just having like a bunch of writers here, I think, as many different creative ways in which we can connect with our writers. I like to share, but I always brag on Latoya's like approach. I think it's super cool and interesting, and she has said she's gotten so many breakthroughs that way.
No,
Alex,
that's
was it you
great.
who also told me about the writer and like respectfully, I'm like, this is unhinged, who rewrites her books from the perspective of every other character who's in it?
Wow.
No, that was not me, but whoa,
Yes,
that's a
I think
lot.
about it all the time and I like mad respect, unhinged behavior. Like very cool, could not be me. But and I imagine like what a great way to get in their head. And I'll have to do some digging to remember who it is. But like building on what you were saying, one of the crazy ways that we get creative to learn who our characters are.
This
About
Yep.
that idea of rewriting from different points of view is just trying to find the voice of the book. Like
Mhm.
when you're trying to dive in the beginning and you're like, I don't know how this sounds, because you might not be in the right character's head. So that's really interesting
Yes.
and too much work.
in thinking about these like secondary, tertiary, the other people populating the story, is there a rubric you all have for when you need to do deep dives into other characters? Is there anyone populating your stories that isn't fully developed? And how do you know when or when not to put in that work? Sherri, we'll start with you.
It's interesting because for me, these characters just pop up, and it's a bit like a non-player character in a video game. Like they serve some purpose I didn't necessarily know was needed, and they say their lines and they move on. And I think it actually can be dangerous to um, get too involved in their lives because they do have a fully fleshed out existence somewhere, and that can derail you from the story you're trying to tell just as much as it might inform the story you're trying to tell. So it's like spelunking with a rope around your waist just in case you go too far afield. But for me, it's if they feel flat, there's nothing interesting about them, I want to go back and figure out like, well, what do they really mean? What do they, if this book is all in someone's head, not my head, but if the main character, if like that, it's like a meditation that the whole world exists inside your mind, then what does everything represent? So I would try to think of what that character represents in my main character's psyche. But also, I think quite often it's easy, and I don't think it's a bad thing to fall back. It might feel like stereotypes when you have sort of basic characters, secondary and tertiary characters, but you are also falling back on archetypes. And so in my mythology and fairy tale psychology classes, one of my professors said the archetype is the gene and the stereotype is the meme. So archetypes exist, right? The archetype of the hero, the archetype of the maiden. But then you have the meme is the contemporary lightweight stereotype of, oh, the final girl, or instead of the maiden, it's the damsel in distress. Or instead of the hero, it's the lone hero action man, like some action hero guy, which is it has its roots in something deeply part of the human experience, right? The collective unconscious. Every culture has these characters, these archetypes, but if we cheapen them, then they don't work. I mean, they might work for a beach read or a bubblegum book, but none of us write that. We all write serious literature. So how do you tap into what's deeper than the thin assumption, you know? And that can help with your main character, but also with the secondary.
I would like to build on that, actually. I think your example of the NPC is so brilliant, especially as someone who's like very much started my video game journey. And I've learned that I'm very similar in how I game and how I write, which is I get to the side quest and I have to do it. So I meet my side character and I have to do it. We have to sit down and I know Diana was asking about programs. I have to sit down with Scrivener, and now I'm doing all of my research and we have to figure it out in this moment or we cannot move forward. Again, I don't know how I thought I was going to be a pantser when I first started writing. But I think, that archetype being the gene line is just such a brilliant way. I mean, you encapsulated the whole thing. You're so right. Exactly what you said.
Soft, my professor. I'm so sorry. I'm blanking on her name right now.
Alex, do you have any other thoughts about kind of how you decide whether to go on these side quests or not? And I love the image of the spelunking with something kind of keeping you tied down.
Side quests with like secondary and tertiary characters.
Mhm.
I think I would add, if you were like, okay, personally, when I'm working on my secondary, tertiary characters, I'm always trying to find their voice. Like I'm just a very voice focused writer. So if, especially for secondary characters, their voice is not very distinct from my main character, and I'm not getting their dialogue and picking that up, then I do need to do the psychology form for them as well. But I will say there's a different way, a couple different ways you can kind of approach secondary and tertiary characters to make sure that, let's say you don't want to write unrealized biases in there, and you want to make sure that you're approaching them well. I always say, like, if you're not doing work to uncover your biases outside of just like your writing process, it's going to kind of make it's going to make its way into your work. But if you're doing that work as while you're writing, you're going to catch yourself as you're writing something that might be problematic or just might just feel awkward and not right. I do this often now that I've written the book. I'll be like, oh wait, I don't want to say that. Nope, that's not the path I want to go. And it it's not the funnest thing, funnest, sorry. It's not the best thing that I about the writing process, but I like that I'm catching myself. And I will also say secondary, tertiary characters do a lot of, you can do a lot of the work in the editing phase. Um, with writing an identity not your own, I really impart on the reader. Editing is where it's at. Like it's really kind of hard sometimes to catch yourself while you're writing, and I understand people need to get in the groove of writing, and once they're like going, it's kind of hard to stop and like go backwards. I'm totally for you to continue going forward. But the editing process, be meticulous. Get other readers. Examine everything from dialogue to how that character, the secondary and tertiary character, interacts with the main character, and is it tropic and stereotypical, or is there something new that's here that kind of brings some authenticity to the character and makes them feel real and grounded. But yeah, editing is fantastic for making sure things are smooth in the story.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Meg, do you have any particular like things you're looking for as you're editing that are particular to making sure your characters are fully rendered?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alex kind of encapsulated it. It is really the hunt for, okay, at first blush, this is what I wrote. And now that I'm looking at it with a second set of eyes, what does this sound like? What does this look like? I think beta readers are really important for that reason. I actually, Alex, as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about how as a culture for a long time, I talk about fan fiction a lot, but like as a culture, we look down on fan fiction a lot. And I think it's really interesting because you see this medium that so many people think of as like a really fluffy side hobby, but you see so many of these writers taking it so much more seriously than traditionally published authors. You know, these are fan fiction authors who are hunting down information about other cultures. They're really researching. They have a plethora of beta readers. And so it's something, you know, I think as I edit my own work of like, how many people can I get this in front of before we hit that publish button? How many people can we talk to? Because there's a lot of experiences I myself haven't lived, and we need to make sure that it, you know, maybe we don't get everything right, but at least we don't look like an asshole. So I think really just trying to put a filter through it and acknowledging that you are not omniscient is a very good first step, you know, owning that you're not perfect and being willing to go and crack open an identity not your own, being able to talk to someone else, being open to accepting beta readers and real feedback is, I think, the biggest step in editing yourself.
Absolutely. Sherri, what about you? What does your editing process look like?
So I tend to, you know, when I've finished a draft, I will take a break and then I'll go back and outline what I have, to see like if it's happening right, you know, if the flow of the story is happening right. But when it comes to characters, so I wrote a book, The Blossom and the Firefly is World War II Japan. And it's a young kamikaze pilot and a junior high school girl. And in 1945. And I knew there was a lot I didn't know. I've written a lot about World War II, but writing from a Japanese perspective affected how the points of view I chose. The girl, I felt I could write her a little bit more than I could write the male character, because I didn't have a grasp of what Japanese male machismo in a 17-year-old guy might be. So I read a lot of diaries and journal entries from war diaries, and but I wrote a draft. I wrote a draft so that I would know what I didn't know. And then I went to Japan with a list of like, Sherri, don't know this. And went around with an interpreter who just helped me stop every person in the town the book is set in who looked to be of an age to have experienced the war, and ask them questions. And that was really helpful. And then you still know you're going to get things wrong, so you do more research. I found books on Japanese culture written by students of English, and Japanese students of English and English students of Japanese, because they were sort of explaining concepts to each other, and that was really informative for me. So that was actually something that bizarrely helps me a lot, are used bookstores. Crawl through a used bookstore, and I found an anthropological study of a small village in Japan near where I was writing that was done in 1935, before the 15-year war started. It was like the last Westerners in Japan to do a study of anything. So that was useful. I've written before, I was ghostwriting for somebody about a story set in the Amazon. And I found a children's book about how food was made in Amazonian villages before the conquistadors came, like in a used bookstore. You can find so many things that it's just kismet. So I do deep dives into books. I'm a little bit more shy about sharing my writing with a lot of people beforehand. And part of that is like, maybe I'm not ready, but also waiting for people to get back to me. In the beginning, the first couple of books, your friends are all like, oh, I'd love to read it. And they give you feedback. You get enough books under you and nobody's interested anymore. So they're like, oh, I'll just buy it. And I'm like, okay, but I need to write it. So that's harder. But I tend to, I do have a few people that will still read for me. And then of course I've got an editor that will interrogate, and I'm always the one saying, don't trust me on this. Let's find an expert, or don't assume I know. There's a weird thing that happens when you're a woman of color, that white editors and publishing people give you a pass on cultural appropriation because, I don't know, like I should know better. Because I'm a minority. I'm a double minority. I should know better, but that doesn't mean that I can't mess up. So and I know that I have messed up in the past. And something that really has hit me lately is, no matter how careful you are today, if your book lives long enough, it will offend somebody, because it's outgrown the culture. The culture has left it behind. And so looking back with some embarrassment at things I've written in the past that were a-okay or were forward thinking at the time and aren't anymore is really sobering. And so I think being prepared to say this was the work I did if somebody questions it, to try to show good faith, and prepared to discuss and to apologize when necessary, I think is all part of writing these days. Probably always was, but we didn't do it back in the day.
Oh, absolutely. Well said. Yeah, just being open to knowing that you don't know everything, being deeply curious. Meg and Alex, I'm curious where you all find your beta readers.
Friends. No, I'm very much at for better or for worse, I'm at the stage where I'm shoving drafts in front of people and saying like, will you read this? But I think the tough thing is, like, at some point you have to go, my sister's great. Is she going to give me the hard truths? Let's be honest. My husband will, which is not cool, not cute. I'm like, no, you're supposed to say this is the best thing I've ever read. But I think, I had a manager once tell me, you have to be okay with failing. And you have to be willing to apologize for that, but you have to be okay to fail first. And it's something, whether it's been writing or my 9 to 5 day job, that I've thought about a lot, is you can't go in expecting perfection. So when finding those beta readers, it's arming yourself with, it's going to be a little tough love. But I also know that there are a lot of writing groups out there, for people to kind of match make their way into finding beta readers. Alex, what about you? How are you seeking these folks out?
Yeah, I'm kind of lucky. My agent has a good, diverse list of writers who are willing to read for me. But sometimes I'll ask people like, look, I need specifically somebody of this identity who is a writer themselves. And I don't always seek out writers to be beta readers, but a lot of times it's very helpful because they just have the language and they like know the critique that I need. Um, but she's great with being like, here's somebody who can specifically talk to this. And so many times that has saved me. I also just have built a good creative writing community within Dallas and beyond Dallas of people who I've met at festivals, who I've met at events, who I go to, poetry readings and get to know poets. And sometimes their feedback on novels is so interesting versus just people who are always writing novels. So I do, and I know that can be difficult for people to really put themselves out there and to go and meet others. But it is helpful to have that creative writing community, whether it's online, in person, et cetera. But you're going to want to call on them. And I also think it's helpful to always suggest, like, I'll read for you in the future, you read for me. Do you know somebody else who would actually be a better fit if you're not available right now? That's fine. I also like to give people deadlines. If they can't make the deadline, that's absolutely okay too. I will go on to the next person. Um, and surprisingly, like my last novel that I had beta readers for, I like got 7 people who were willing and able to give me considerably diverse feedback. It was phenomenal. I couldn't believe I got that many people, especially now in this game. Um, but yeah, I also like to sometimes read at open mics things I'm working on, just to feel if I have a flow, if people seem interested. Of course, I write long novels, etc. So me coming in and only being able to do a short section, it's kind of nice to see, is the language and sentence structure working? Is the character interesting? But yeah, I mix it up on that.
If you had 7 people give you feedback, how do you manage that? Like, because I've been in groups where you get 8 sets of feedback that are all diametrically opposed. So I wonder, how do you sift through and know what's worth keeping for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I also am very I will give people instructions beforehand, like what I'm expecting of them. So I might have somebody who I'm like, hey, you're great at the grammar. Give me all the grammar, editing, sentence structure feedback. That's you. I remember one guy, so a novel that that's on submission. It's about La Llorona, the myth. I found a guy who grew up in Texas and he had never heard of the myth. And I was like, phenomenal. You're a writer, you write horror. I'm not writing horror, but with La Llorona, it's more drama, but you've never heard it. All I want is feedback from you. Am I conveying this myth to somebody who has no idea what this myth is? Like, do you understand the concept going on here? And he did perfectly with that. With my second novel, Rocky, with Half Outlaw, I had a character who had a queer identity, and I had some sex scenes, and I really hadn't written sex scenes before. And I wanted to make sure that it was authentic and it wasn't coming across incorrectly. And so I asked her, hey, I just want you to focus really on her sexual orientation and the experiences that she is having with other women. And that was phenomenal. I am, I will, whenever I get feedback, no matter what it is, I will read it. Usually, I'll read it once, set it down for 3 days to a week, read it again with fresh eyes where my blood isn't rising and go like, okay, let me consider what they say. most of the time it's pretty good. I feel like I'm pretty good with picking beta readers. And I am just waiting for feedback. I know that there's something else I could do here. So I'm waiting for the feedback. If it's not a fit, I will make a note, put it aside, and talk to my agent if she like approaches me and says, "Hey, we need to do something about this." And I'm like, "Oh, somebody else noted that, then I probably do need to change that." Yeah. Or what do you think? Do I need to focus on this? Somebody brought it up. Is it worth looking at or not?
Such good advice to sort of curate the feedback before you request it. That's a great takeaway from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I often think of, the workshop model sitting around and everyone's just giving, like you were saying, Sherri, diametrically opposed advice. So that's great to give targeted, I need this from you, I need this from you. That's great, Alex. Thank you. I know it's common to find character inspiration from real people in your life. How do you all kind of approach doing that without avoiding becoming like the next bad art friend? How do you pull from your experience, but do so in a way that's ethical?
Wait, everybody go to New York Times and read The Bad Art Friend after this. I'm so glad you brought that up. That's
It lives
amazing
rent-free in
reference.
my mind all the time. So
I even mention it in Writing an Identity Not Your Own. That can happen. Yeah. How do I pull from my life? I'll just start since I was speaking. It can be hard sometimes. I think it is respectful, and I haven't always done this, so I will say, like, to be fair with my first novel, maybe I pulled some stories from my family that, looking back, I wish I had talked to people before pulling some of those stories. And I don't want to move forward um, not speaking with people about their stories and how I can incorporate them. Granted, like some, I, even if I do pull from my life, I do try to change it up so much or make it so exaggerated or minimize something like a personality of a character so much so that nobody would recognize what was going on. Um, I mean, it can be hard to not pull from your life, and I think if I'm existing in this world and I'm interacting with the world and other people, my interactions with them, yeah, definitely might show up in my work, and people are forewarned if they're in my zone that that might happen. But I think there's a way to know like when something is taking it a step too far, like and we're doing invasion of privacy or we're re-owning someone's story and not giving proper credit to them in the reference section or the editor's note of the book, etc.
Meg, what about you? How do you think about kind of pulling from your life in a way that
Yeah, I think,
yeah.
I mean, with Titties, it was really interesting because it was citing real sources and then real life examples. So part of it, I think, Alex kind of talked about like you have to kind of make a decision about this story you're telling and like what you're okay with. And so for a couple of these, like I note a couple like workplace experiences that I had that were definitely not like HR friendly. And it's for me, that was like a devil may care. If you go down enough of a LinkedIn rabbit hole and you figure this out, good for you. Similarly, I mean, like even going so far as to just like mention an ex, not by name, but an ex who made me read a lot of science fiction once said, those were chances that I felt like I could take. But for me, writing Titties, genuinely the bigger concern was talking about these authors with the fear of, in theory, I would like to write another book. And having to be aware of like these things that I'm saying about James Patterson or Stephen King. Maybe he knows that I exist, maybe he doesn't, but I'm putting a very harsh opinion out into the world, and what will that ripple effect maybe? And it's really easy, I think, especially as someone who tends to hide behind this kind of like snarky, spiteful wall, to say, let's send a copy of A Tale of Two Titties to Stephen King and get a blurb. And that's where it's like, it's really important to have people in your life who are willing to rein you back in and say, do you ever want to be published again? Let's maybe think about this. So in on the one hand, you know, identifying the risks that you're willing to take, and on the other hand, having a good group of people who are able to kind of temper your feelings when you're feeling really, really, when you have big feelings. But I think you kind of have to wait until a certain amount of time has passed for some stories. I've got some personal ones that I'm like holding on to that they'll be really interesting when the time comes. So it's, I think, just making, you know, rational decisions.
Well said. Sherri, what about you? How do you think about pulling from real life and people you know?
Meg said's really important because I work with a lot of students that are writing memoir and things like that. And it's like, you know, it helps to have 10 years between you and that moment. Like, unless you're Carrie Bradshaw writing about your last date, like, don't do it. I've had people writing almost real time, and it's very, you can't critique the work because you're criticizing a person's life in a lived experience. So I don't tend to draw from my own life in a big chunk kind of way. I write sort of across genres, and I write a lot historical, so that helps, but I will draw from emotional experience. Or I will draw from little things, you know, so there'll be some Easter eggs, like that's my, you know, my grandmother's beauty parlor in that story, and that's this, that's that. But only a handful of times have I based one character. One character in my very first book was based on a guy that I knew, who A, I knew would never read the book, and B, it was different enough, you know, the setting and everything was different enough that, and he wasn't causing any harm in the story. So I would have been proud to give him the book and say, hey, I based that guy on you. And I think that's a really good litmus test. Same thing for writing outside of your lane. If you're borrowing from someone else's life or your own life, would you be willing to read it out loud to that person, or to watch them read it to you? You know, and if the answer is no, then don't do it. Just don't do it. It's not worth it, because you're causing harm and you're trying to get away with something. And you should not be. I had the experience of being invited by a writer I knew to a play, and we had become friendly, and I had told them some personal stories, and they had been working on this play for a long time and hadn't been able to complete it. And one day they were like, I finished my play and we're putting it up. And I sat there and watched a scene from my life unfold. And I was like, oh, I remember that dinner when I told this story. And it was so horrifying. And I've never confronted them, because, you know, you can't copyright your life. Like maybe like other people have had a similar experience, or maybe she forgot that it was a personal experience and used it, you know, suddenly had a good idea and wasn't aware of it. But it made me feel really, really naked, even though nobody else knew. And it was awful.
That's rough, Sherri.
Yeah, well, you know, and like, I'm not in therapy over it or anything. It wasn't that deep. It was just, it's a good way to feel used, you know? So, if you care about the people around you, just don't do it. If you want to honor their story, ask.
Well said. I have so many more questions, but we also have a lot in the Q&A box. So I'm going to jump to our audience questions, and then if there's time, we'll go back to some questions I have. But this first question, if I have two main characters driving the plot, interacting with minor and side characters, and both characters are from different backgrounds, how do you subtly bring them together to form a concrete pair of thinking minds to solve the problem in the plot? Sherri, what do you think?
You see me smiling. I'm looking at my reading desk and realizing my books, my husband has I think we've put it on the wrong shelf. So there's a woman named Dara Marks. She's got a PhD in mythological studies, which is my dream degree, from Pacifica Institute, and she's a script doctor. And she in that book, she diagrams a bunch of movies and shows you like how things come together. And one of the movies she diagrams is Lethal Weapon, which is a brilliant movie. Whether you agree with me or not, it is. Just believe me, it's a brilliant movie. Mel Gibson, problematic, sure. Danny Glover, not a problem at all. And it is. She does this with a few movies of how you take two characters and how they have the same sort of arc, and for them, like Gibson plays Riggs, who's a cop with a death wish because his wife died and he's miserable and he's reckless. And Danny Glover is a short timer cop who is about to retire and wants to be super safe. They are both warrior archetypes, and they're each on a journey, one towards life, coming back to life, and the other towards death. So one has to learn to live again, and the other one has to be willing to die for something. And that dovetails so beautifully in that. So I would take a look at that book. It is a bit of a mind blow and might be too advanced. Like, I know I have struggled after looking at it going, how do I be that brilliant? And I'm not. But your two characters are there for a reason. For me, the main thing I would ask is, what do they each want? And I would go from there.
Well said. Here's another good one. With characters that may already have a backstory, for example, Greek gods, how do you make those characters your own rather than sticking to the myths or their histories? Alex, what do you think?
I love this. Also, I would love a degree in mythology. I would be in the library in undergrad, right? Yeah. I would go to the library in undergrad, which our library was not impressive at our college, but I was always like mythology section, reading things from around the world. Yeah, so when I was working on La Llorona, my novel, there's no matter what myth there is, it's usually like pretty short. It's not very long. We've heard it been told the same way for all of history. I like to approach it kind of from a modern lens. And so what I did with La Llorona is I looked at the psychology of somebody who effectively drowns her children within this myth. And if we're looking at it from a modern perspective, why would a woman do that? Back in the day, they would have just said, oh, she was evil, she was spiteful because her husband or boyfriend or the father of those children was cheating on her or being with somebody else and wanted to leave her. So she was spiteful. That's like a very simple perspective. We have the benefit of science and psychology and understanding that situations that happen in these myths are way more complicated, and there's so much missing from that story that we've lost over time because it wasn't written down or it was translated in a billion different languages, and we've lost things from it. So I looked at the La Llorona myth from a psychology standpoint and was thinking, oh, postpartum depression. Nobody knew what that was in the 1500s or the 1300s. So if I'm going to approach writing La Llorona, I'm going to be thinking about postpartum depression. I'm going to be thinking about the depression that's going to come after you have, effectively unalived your children. What does that do to a person? Will that lead to other forms of like coping and dependency, etc.? I think just look for the gaps within those mythologies and those stories, and think about why a character within that myth would do that thing. Is there something that we know now that back then they wouldn't have even thought of in terms of telling that story?
Absolutely. Well said. Here's an interesting question. How do you self-center a character in a long, complex story that includes different scenarios and circumstances? Any thoughts? I think,
Could you repeat the question?
how do you self-center a character in a long, complex story that includes different scenarios and circumstances?
I think this is actually really similar to what Sherri mentioned at the top of this call about what do they want, and using that, what do they want and what do they need, and doing that exercise as a way to find the red thread. And the red thread of what they think that they're driving to and what they really are working towards is a really strong way and a really strong exercise that I at least have found really helpful.
Oh, absolutely.
I would add, like, it sounds here that like the plot is very clear in the writer's mind, and it sounds like maybe they need to get to know their character a little bit like more deeply, like have a really sit down chat with them in your mind, and maybe a writing exercise or such, so that you know how they're going to react to every single thing in that long, complex story. Are they going to shut down when they're faced with an obstacle, or are they going to get invigorated and motivated, or are they going to clash with people that they come in contact with in that story? So really understand like their personality and how it's going to affect them on that very long, complex journey within the story. It'd be helpful.
Thank you both.
The danger there is that there's no why. Things are happening. Things are just happening, and that's not a story. There has to be a reason why they're happening, and it shapes your character arc. Who do they become as a result?
Absolutely. We talked a little bit. I just want to give you all another opportunity to say things you've heard of or things that you use. But there's a question about what exercises you do to get to know your characters. And I know we've mentioned some. This person mentioned knowing what their protagonist buys at the grocery store. And Alex, I know you talked about your kind of like intake form. And told the story about LaToya taking characters to therapy. Are there any other kind of exercises you all can think of that maybe weren't mentioned earlier that you want to share?
Just a couple of things that I will suggest is have your character write a letter of protest, because you'll learn what they care about and how they argue, and that's useful. I think it can also be fun to have your character wash the dishes. Get detailed about it. What did the dishes mean? What are those dishes? I watched a documentary about a potter, and every time he washed a cup, he told the story of who it was made for, what it belonged to, and that really struck me. So I think it's a really fun exercise.
I like that. I'll also add, I have suggested, sorry if that was, I've suggested Facebook rants. Like if your character was doing a rant on Facebook, or what they ran about. I also like, I can't remember. It's like a very famous exercise, but basically like pretend your character's looking at like a house or an object, in which this is kind of similar to the dishwasher thing. And what does that remind them of, and what memory and story does that kind of come up for them when they're looking at that? And I think it was like the exercise was about a guy looking at a barn, and it really wasn't about a barn, but he was talking about this barn, but you could tell that there was more to this barn than what it seemed. Yeah. I also like having characters talk to people they don't like or people they really do like in a dialogue scene, and see what they're gonna do.
Those are great, great activities. I love how just creative people can get with these activities to even get to know. It just sounds like a lot of fun to
So
investigate.
funny because you guys sound so brilliant and on top of it, and I feel very binary, and I'm like, I have a pros and cons list, we have a word map, like we are not doing situational analyses, and now I feel like I have a great amount of homework to take home following this panel.
Everything, it works differently for everybody, and some people don't need that much to be able to build a mansion, and other people might need a lot more tools. It just depends how your mind works.
Meg, you did mention like a character map. Is that something you like literally draw out?
Yes, as we go further, it's really interesting having these conversations, and when I was on my little book tour chatting with other authors, because I have never taken an MFA class. I feel very much this Writers League of Texas has been invaluable for reasons Alex mentioned earlier about finding community. And I think when you're just like a little baby writer who is like suddenly putting work out into the ether, you're realizing one, the ways you're approaching things are not always the easiest or even most original ways, and that there's better ways to do things. And so as someone who's always been very much a paper and pen girly, you know, I do tend to sit here with note cards of like, how are we character mapping it? What do they care? How does this character and this character connect? How do they mirror each other? You know, I've got, Alex has heard me wax poetic about my like Camelot, you know, reinvention story. And so it's, you know, how do we take this character who's so maligned in Arthurian history and make her into, you know, this is why. And I very much am drawn to villains. And so when writing them and like building these characters, it's for me like, okay, how much can I put the reader through that they will continue to forgive this character for, because they know the backstory? Like, what is the straw that breaks the camel's back? But yeah, I mean, I really will do like a word map. I will put nope, oh my goodness, like post-it notes on the wall. I will write out pages. And then I'll lose them all and we'll have to start over. So maybe
This is
don't.
why you have a journal. You need,
Yes.
writer journal. Yeah.
Scrivener was a really big game changer, you know, for that piece of having that kind of separation. I also, my sister's very artistic. And so if I ask nicely, she'll draw an actual map of the fantasy world, which has been like a game changer. It does make me feel like a much more serious writer.
Can I also suggest one more thing? I don't do this. I've heard another writer who does this, and I can't remember who said it, but if they want to know how their character would behave, they'll go out in public to like a coffee shop and pretend to be that character. They will speak like that character. They will walk like what they think that character walks. They will interact with other people however they think that character is, which is so brave and very cool and meta. I will say sometimes I do need to stand up from my desk and be um, like feel how my character moves a little bit. I do an exercise where I encourage people to like think about how a character's body feels, like in terms of their weight, in terms of their height, in terms of the length of their arms and legs, and the way clothes fit them, and how they smell to themselves. If they're moving in a packed room of people, how are they like moving like this? Or they very like move out of my way, I'm here. So sometimes I will stand up from the desk and be like, I have to get in the stance of my secondary character to really see what his attitude is kind of like.
Yeah, this is very morbid, but I like, again, I really like the villains, but I really like to think too about, I can't believe I'm saying this out. I like to think about how they die and how they mourn, because I think that's also like such an intimate thing of everyone feels grief. I think it's like one of those biggest feelings that you can feel. And where does that take you? Is it a place of vitriol, or is it just numbness? And similarly, you know, if you're dying, kind of how are you dealing? Are you going quietly into that dark night, or are you holding on to the end? I think it's just a really like interesting and raw way to tap into that mindset.
These are all incredible. We're at time. I've learned so much. I've taken notes. I'm also a paper pen girly. I know that the chat has been blowing up. I think people are sharing resources. This has been just a really phenomenal discussion. I want to thank you all so much for being here, for spending your Thursday evening with us. I want to thank to our audience for being here, spending Thursday night with us. Thank you to all of you on the YouTube live stream. I implore you to get our panelists' books. You will learn so much from their books. I mean, we've just scratched the surface of what they have to impart with their writing. And so, yeah, thank you all for being here, and have a great evening. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad we got to chat.
This was great. Thank y'all so much.